We now come to the statement from the Foreign Secretary. Welcome to the dispatch box, Foreign Secretary James Cleverly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will update the House on the situation in Ukraine. This morning, Russian missiles again struck Kyiv and other cities, destroying critical national infrastructure and depriving Ukrainians of water and electricity. Earlier today, I spoke to our ambassador in Kyiv, and I heard again of the extraordinary resilience of Ukraine's people in the face of Russian aggression. At the weekend, Russia suspended its participation in the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which has allowed the exportation of 100,000 tons of food every day, including to some of the least developed countries in the world. Putin is exacting vengeance for his military failures on the civilians of Ukraine by cutting off their power and their water supply, and on the poorest people in the world by threatening their food supplies. Over 60% of the wheat exported under the Black Sea Grain Initiative has gone to low and middle income countries, including Ethiopia, Yemen, and Afghanistan. It would be unconscionable for those lands to be made to suffer because of Putin's setbacks on the battlefield in Ukraine. I urge Russia to stop impeding this vital initiative that is helping feed the hungry across the world and agree to its extension. Meanwhile, Russia's suicide drones and cruise missiles are killing Ukrainian civilians, obliterating their homes, and even destroying a children's playground. A third of the country's power stations were put out of operation in a single week. None of this achieves any military purpose. Putin's only aim is to spread terror and to deprive Ukrainian families of shelter, light, and heat as harsh winter approaches. I'm sure the House will join me in condemning his breaches of international humanitarian law. I'm sure every honourable and right honourable member will share my conviction that Putin will never break the spirit of the Ukrainian people. And this House will share my incredulity at the glaring contradictions in Putin's thinking. He claims that Ukraine is part of Russia and that Ukrainians are Russians. But at the same time, he calls them Nazis who must be bombed without mercy. When he launched his invasion, he convinced himself that Russian forces would be welcomed in Kyiv, and they would either support him or be too craven to stand in his way. He could not have been more wrong. The last 8 months has shown the scale of his miscalculation. They have shown the barbarity of his onslaught, including the mass rape committed by Russian soldiers in Ukraine. The UK's campaign to prevent sexual violence in conflict is more urgent now than ever, and I will host a conference on this vital subject next month. And now, the Kremlin is resorting to peddling false claims, churning out invented stories that say more about the fractures within the Russian government than they do about us. It is also reprehensible that Iran should have supplied Russia with the Shahed drones that are bringing destruction to Ukraine in violation of UN Resolution 2231. On the 20th of October, the government imposed sanctions on 3 Iranian commanders involved in supplying weaponry to Russia, along with the company that manufactures Shahed drones. Earlier, Putin announced on the 30th of September that Russia had annexed 4 regions of Ukraine spanning 40,000 square miles, the biggest land grab in Europe since the Second World War. Once again, this exposes his self-delusion. Putin has declared the annexation of territory he has not captured. And what he had managed to seize, he is in the process of losing. On the 12th of October, 143 countries, 3/4 of the entire membership of the United Nations, voted in the General Assembly to condemn the annexation. Russia had just 4 supporters: Syria, Belarus, Nicaragua, North Korea. And when those regimes are your only friends, you really know that you are isolated. When 141 countries denounced Putin's invasion back in March, some speculated that that was the ceiling of the international support for Ukraine. The latest vote showed even more nations are now ready to condemn Russia. But Putin still thinks that by forcing up food and energy prices, we will lose our resolve. Our task is to prove him wrong. We will not waver in our support for Ukraine's right to self-defense. I delivered that emphatic message when I spoke to my Ukrainian counterpart on Tuesday, and my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, said the same to President Zelensky when they spoke on the phone, the first foreign leader that he called upon his appointment as Prime Minister. On Thursday, I will attend a meeting of G7 foreign ministers in Germany, where I will send a unified signal of our shared determination. This year, Britain gave Ukraine £2.3 billion worth of military support, more than any country in the world apart from the United States of America. We will provide Ukraine with more support to repair its energy infrastructure, and we have committed to £220 million of humanitarian aid. The House will have noted Putin's irresponsible talk about nuclear weapons and an absurd claim that Ukraine plans to detonate a radiological dirty bomb on its own territory. No other country is talking about nuclear use. No country is threatening Russia or threatening President Putin. He should be clear that for the UK and our allies, any use at all of nuclear weapons would fundamentally change the nature of this conflict. There would be severe consequences for Russia. And how counterproductive would it be for Russia to break a norm against nuclear use that has held since 1945 and has underpinned global security? Nothing will alter our conviction that the Ukrainians have a right to live in peace and freedom in their own lands. If Putin were to succeed, every expansionist tyrant would be emboldened to do their worst, and no country would be safe. That is why we stand and will continue to stand alongside our Ukrainian friends until the day comes, as it inevitably will, that they prevail. Mr. Speaker, I commend the statement to the House.
Yeah. Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the war in Ukraine is at a critical new stage. Increasing missile and drone attacks, the senseless withdrawal from the grain export deal that would lead to increasing hunger around the world, and as we enter the winter months, Putin's rhetoric is becoming increasingly irresponsible, including his references to nuclear weapons and dangerous fabrications around a so-called dirty bomb. And I support the Foreign Secretary's words on that matter. This is a sign of Putin's desperation, but this does not mean an end is near. This will be a long and protracted conflict. This morning, more than 50 missiles were launched by Russian forces against Ukrainian energy and water systems over the course of just a few hours. This isn't an isolated attack, but a deliberate and callous Russian strategy to target civilian infrastructure ahead of the winter. Mr. Speaker, some estimates claim almost a third of Ukraine's power stations and other energy facilities have been hit, and 80% of Kyiv has been left without water after these latest attacks. The Foreign Secretary mentioned his discussions with our ambassador on the ground. I am sure the whole House are grateful to the embassy team for their continuing work in very challenging conditions. Can the Foreign Secretary set out today how many electricity generators the UK has already sent to Ukraine and how we will strengthen Ukraine's energy supply at this time? Some of these attacks have been conducted using Iranian-supplied drones. We welcome the sanctions already announced against the Iranian regime. What further measures is the government considering to prevent Iran's material support to Russia's invasion? Over the past week, we've also seen Russia engage in baseless, ridiculous accusations that the United Kingdom was involved in the destruction of part of the Nord Stream pipeline. What is the government doing to tackle the dangerous disinformation being spread by Putin? Mr. Speaker, the UN-backed agreement on grain exports has been vital in reducing global food prices. President Putin's unjustifiable decision to pull out of this deal will have catastrophic consequences. It comes at a time when many countries are already food insecure, including Somalia, where an imminent famine is feared. This decision should be seen by the world for what it is: the Kremlin's cruel and transparent use of hunger to blackmail. Any spike in world food prices will be the responsibility of the Russian government. An agreement must be restored. Can the Foreign Secretary outline what conversations he's had with counterparts, including Turkey, on the potential for restoring grain flows? And what steps the UK is considering to mitigate the worst consequences for the developing world if those efforts fail? Since the end of August, Ukraine has been conducting successful counter-offensive operations in the south and east of Ukraine, liberating around 12,000 square kilometres. But Russia continues to attempt to make progress in the Donbass and Bakhmut. Winter is coming. Any counter-offensives could soon slow, and an operational stalemate is likely for the next couple of months. It is day 249 of the invasion, and the Ministry of Defence has not even signed a contract to replenish the NLAW's anti-tank missiles, which has been vital to the Ukrainian army. Will the government restock and resupply Ukraine and the British Armed Forces with essential military assistance? Over 20 NATO countries have now rebooted defence plans since the invasion began, but the UK government has still not done so. Will he update the integrated review of the foreign and defence policy and continue what was indicated by the last Prime Minister? Now we are on our third in just 3 months. Mr. Speaker, last month the UN, at the United Nations, more countries than ever voted to condemn Russia in its illegal and unjustifiable annexation of Ukrainian territory. The world saw through the sham referendums and recognised Russia's actions as a flagrant violation of the UN Charter. We must sustain and grow the diplomatic coalition against Putin, because the outcome of this war will depend on who is more resilient: Putin's Russia or Ukraine and its supporters in the West and beyond. Labour is clear. We won't let our support for Ukraine falter. Our duty now is to make sure Ukraine wins. This means providing the diplomatic and military support required, but also moving beyond ad hoc announcements and laying out a long-term strategy for military, economic and diplomatic assistance through 2023 and beyond. We have to reinforce the message to Putin: continuing this barbaric war will make it worse, not better, for Russia.
Foreign Secretary.
I thank my opposite number, the Right Honourable Gentleman, for the points that he's made, and echoing from his benches the support for the Ukrainian people and their attempts to, or their work to eject Russia from their homelands. I think it is noticed that whilst we often disagree, sometime on detail, our collective response is to support the Ukrainian people. That will be noted, and I think they will be incredibly grateful for that. He raises a number of points which I will attempt to cover in my response. In terms of the energy needs of the Ukrainian people going into the winter, the UK has pledged £100 million to support Ukraine's energy security and to reform, and £74 million in fiscal grants to support Ukraine through the World Bank. With his specific question about the number of generators, I will seek to get more details of that and share those with him at an appropriate point in the future. With regard to Iran, he notes the fact that we have already sanctioned a number of people, as I made in the point I made in my statement. He will know that we do not discuss future sanctions designations, but I can assure him that we will be keeping a close eye on Iran and indeed any other country's actions in terms of providing arms for Russia, and we will take appropriate actions to dissuade them from doing so and to react if they do. He is absolutely right to highlight the situation with regard to disinformation. We have seen increasingly desperate statements coming out of the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Kremlin. Those claims are designed to distract the Russian people and indeed the wider international community from the truth. And the truth is that the Ukrainians are pushing Russian forces back on the battlefield. We must not be distracted from that truth, and he is absolutely right that we must work with our international allies to make sure that Russia's disinformation campaign does not influence global support for the Ukrainian people. He also mentioned grain exports, and I've spoken with my Turkish counterparts in the past, expressing our gratitude for the work that they've done securing that grain export deal. And we've also reinforced the need for that to be extended and for Russia to lift the pause on their engagement with that. This is about ensuring that the global poor, those people who are already suffering from hunger, are not drawn into a conflict not of their choosing. And we must not let Vladimir Putin use global hunger as leverage to undermine support for the Ukrainians in the defence of their homelands. He asks about the supply of anti-tank missile systems. We are committed to matching our support next year as we have done for this year. We will ensure that the Ukrainians are supplied with the arms most relevant to the needs at the time. Obviously, in the initial conflict, the initial phases of the conflict, those NLAWs and other anti-tank missile systems were incredibly important to them. What we're now seeing as the battlefield has evolved, ground-to-air missile systems and air-to-air missile systems have increased in importance. We'll make sure that our support to Ukraine matches their needs, but we'll also ensure that we don't denude our own armed forces of requirements, and action has been taken to stimulate the supply chain for critical military equipment. We will always ensure that we adapt to the circumstances on the ground, on the battlefield, and also ensure that we don't, as I say, denude ourselves of our ability to defend this country as well as our friends and allies.
Yeah.